Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with my Gameweek 35 cheat sheet preview. This is an essential week because as we are planning towards Gameweek 36, we still don't know the full news about Man City's double game week fixture potentially, whether it falls on 36 or whether it falls on 37. And another impact is going to be how you sort of view the European continental fixtures and how they've impacted rotation. If you look at teams like Leicester in recent weeks, we've seen players like Barnes continue to get rotated. Part of that is due to form that Barnes hasn't really been showing, bar the sort of goal that he got versus Everton. And then also the other impacts being a team like Man City, where you can probably expect rotation because of how significant the second fixture is versus Real Madrid, as they unfortunately weren't able to kind of create a significant lead in the first leg, even though they played very, very well. With Liverpool versus Villarreal and even the Leicester and West Ham fixtures, those will also have a little bit of impacts on your decision making this week. And I can see a little bit more preference towards going back to some of the assets who play not in the European league, such as Arsenal, where in recent weeks I would say people were probably quite down on Arsenal until Saka had a major haul once again. And also scored a penalty, of course, versus Chelsea, but in a game where he wasn't necessarily one of the key difference makers, I would say. In the United game is very significant what he brings to FPL, and I think he is closely becoming an essential asset, and also another asset who is pretty much responsible for destroying me this season, and my fault and my fault alone. But if we head towards the defenders this week, as I said, even though a lot of the European fixtures have to be sort of counted out, you have to sort of see the impacts it has on a player like Amarte. He's constantly being rotated, and I really struggle to see how he provides, other than a little bit of gap filling in terms of your bench, just in case you need someone with that sort of budget, how he provides any utility for your team. Someone like Ben White is still a little bit more interesting because he will be playing both fixtures, provided that he doesn't hit any injuries. With Newcastle, you have, unfortunately, less fixtures available, and that just simply means that Schär will fall. The actual run of fixtures isn't perfect as well, so I think there's no real reason to look at Schär now, especially after he was rested in the previous Newcastle game. With Burnley defenders and Chambers, I would say they're still interesting in the sense that Burnley have a double game week fixture in 37, and Chambers is someone who will be playing for Villa, but still no real interest there, because if you are going for a Villa defender, you probably want to go for cash, or maybe even make a gamble towards Martinez if you absolutely must. With the Burnley defender, I would say it's a similar logic where I'd probably go for Pope, because so many people are actually heading towards teams where they have 4 to 5 defenders. I just can't really see myself putting a 5th defender in my team, and that player playing Game Week 37. I'd much rather have someone who could be an interesting asset in 36. But you also might maybe disagree with this logic and actually prefer going for someone like a Crystal Palace defender who could be interesting because their defensive stats have been quite solid. They posted a lot of clean sheets, and so on and so forth. With the rise in the 4.6 to 5.0 range, Emerson is someone who actually finds himself on this list. The reason why is because I think, unfortunately, with Doherty still being out for the rest of the season, and you have the rotation in the left back area, Emerson probably is the most interesting Spurs asset. It's very clear that without the fullbacks being so attacking and so pervasive, like Doherty was in a sort of hot run of form, that Emerson slightly pales in comparison. But we have seen Tottenham actually hold quite well in terms of actually creating clean sheets. And that's a little bit of a positive where Emerson could be a dual-edged sword as we head towards the later fixtures. The one problem, of course, is that Emerson has a tricky double game week 36 where you do expect him to lose his clean sheets. And when you actually look at how he's actually gotten his points lately, it's actually through clean sheets. So that is a little bit of a worrisome trend. Cody falls just because the fixtures aren't perfect. And generally, we've seen probably a drop in form of this Wolves team, who have not only struggled to keep clean sheets, but also continue to struggle providing effective chances and actually creating effective chances. So I would actually look at even Wolves as a team to target to actually look for a clean sheet too. As far as the 5.0 to 5.3 range, Cash and Reguilon, they've had a little bit of a symbiotic relationship this season, where I think at times where you prefer Reguilon, you probably don't prefer Cash. And now we've kind of headed into the phase where Reguilon is once again rotation prone, and Cash has beautiful fixtures in 36 and 37. Not necessarily in the double that actually features Liverpool, but just in terms of his overall value week to week. I think Cash is a fantastic option as a 5th defender as we look to round out our teams. A lot of people did move into a double City, double Liverpool defense, and I can't really fault it. Some people have also recognized the worth of Alonso, and as I mentioned last week, Alonso was a very clear rise because it was very clear that for me, Tuchel, as a manager who likes to actually keep players that he thinks are in form, that Alonso had actually found his way back into his plans, and especially with the drop in former players like Azpilicueta and Sarr, their inability to play the left centre-back position, now that Rudiger is still seemingly injured, although he is back in training, so kind of keep watch of that. That has major impacts on the Chelsea defence, but Alonso still provides a lot of utility because he is in these attacking positions. As I said, with Cash, I think we haven't seen anything close to sort of his historic and sort of meteoric sort of point hauls in the double game week fixtures, and this Aston Villa team has started to struggle, I would say, especially with Coutinho no longer being able to dictate things in games week to week. That has sort of diminished the impact of an attacking fullback like Cash and his ability to sort of hit a higher ceiling, and I think that is slightly worrisome, so I'm not really keen on putting Cash as a top option right now. As far as the 6+ options, I've only dropped James and Rudiger, and that's mostly because of, for me, the concerns of what happens when you are returning from injury. So even though James and Rudiger are coming back from injury, we could see a little bit of rest and rotation because Tuchel will probably prioritize making sure that they actually end up heading towards the FA Cup final fit. And for me, that's the priority here because they got a massive 3-point haul versus West Ham and have probably secured that sort of third place spot within the Premier League, as teams like Arsenal and Tottenham will have sort of mirror matchups and things that will actually make them lose points compared to Chelsea. As far as goalkeepers, though, we have someone like Guaita coming in. Guaita is interesting, as I said, because he will be playing for this Crystal Palace team and could be an easy way to get a Crystal Palace sort of defender without actually having to dip into a fifth defender such as a Mitchell. So that is a little bit of an interesting way to play. I think a lot of us still have keepers that will double in 36 or 37, excuse me. Schmeichel being the key option there, where he is clearly, I think, definitively the best sole goalkeeper in the Premier League, and we've seen consistent hauls from him lately. A slight improvement actually in Leicester's defense and their underlying stats, but also just the kind of value he brings as someone who actually somehow manages to save a lot of penalties. Guaita is someone who does play on 37 and could be a little bit of differential, but would I be too interested in Guaita? Probably not, unless it was for budget-related reasons and you were on a wild card. Pope gets a little bit of a rise because we have seen this Burnley team improve in many sort of statistical ways. We only have seen 3 sort of matches since Sean Dyche has been sacked, but there has been great improvements both on the defensive end and the attacking end, and I'll talk about that when I actually look at an option like Weghorst a little bit later. As far as the midfielders, if we head into them now, you can see there hasn't been any movement in terms of the budget slots. I have actually included Ismaila Sarr, though, as an option between the 5.0 to 6.2 range, and what's interesting about him is going to be Watford's rather easy double, or at least healthy double, in the sense that I would expect him to get points as someone who still has the faith of Roy Hodgson to actually start consistently in the right wing position. His underlying stats have actually looked good lately, although we haven't really seen much production from him in terms of actual goals and assists. I do think he could be quite a differential option on that sort of specific week of game week 36. However, people might be leaning towards keeping an option like Dennis if they already still have Dennis in their team, or bringing Dennis in just because there's such a lack of forward diversity in FPL right now. As far as Saka, he remains as a top option in the 6.3 to 6.7 range, but there is a concern about his injury, so please do stay tuned to Arteta's press conference. As far as Maddison, even though we do have some concerns over rotation due to Leicester's involvement in Europe and their kind of fixture with Roma set to be happening very close towards the deadline, I would say Maddison is still a top option because of the impacts of him playing in 36 and 37. Clearly, Barnes is someone who actually falls. It's just very clear now with the amount of rotation that he's been subject to that when you hit this double game week in 36 or 37, even though the fixtures are so good for Leicester, I still wouldn't really back Barnes. And I would say when you actually reflect on his goal scored versus Everton, I would say yes, part of that was due to good positioning, but really when it comes to his output within the 90 minutes on the pitch, it's very clear that Brendan Rodgers doesn't really see much coming from Barnes and actually prefers going for Lookman right now. Perhaps I'll be wrong and Barnes will start in the Roma game and sort of turn some heads, but for now I would definitely say he's a fall. And either way, he's going to be subject to rotation because he will be involved in Europe, and we've seen a lot of rotation come out of him lately, so I would expect for that pattern to remain the same. As far as Kulusevski, he is someone who falls this week, and it's not necessarily because I think his impact has dropped and I think that he was a little bit of a flash in the pan. I think that's the contrary. I just still think that Kulusevski is now playing in a Tottenham team that have slightly struggled with the impacts of the fullback injuries, and there is a little bit of jaggedness that we can kind of see with this Spurs team, where I think they are struggling a little bit with the lack of depth, and unfortunately with Lucas Moura and Bergwijn not being really used in the rotation, we can see that I would say Kane, Son, and Kulusevski aren't able to sort of fire on all cylinders week to week the same way such as the Liverpool front three do, with the kind of rotation of Jota and Diaz there. So I think that's a little bit of a concern, and if you don't really have, let's say, Saka and Maddison, I would say that they're much more interesting as options to sort of keep and make sure that you actually both protect yourself and keep some of the better attacking options as we head into Game Week 36, as opposed to kind of keeping a Kulusevski around, who could be a little bit of a differential as people move slowly out of him. As far as the 6.9 to 7.9 range, I preemptively dropped Havertz. I actually just wasn't really interested in his performance whatsoever versus West Ham. And for Mount, I would say, for me, he still has the faith of Tuchel to stay on the pitch. He's played an absurd amount of minutes lately, and I do expect perhaps Mount to actually suffer from a rotation, but I would probably expect for that to happen after the United game. Perhaps if you've already gone into both Mount and Havertz, you'd like to move out of one of them into more interesting options such as Coutinho and Zaha. The reason why Coutinho and Zaha rise is simply just because the amount of fixtures available and their utility over 36 and 37. So if you are 3 hitting in 37, do keep in mind that Coutinho isn't necessarily showing fantastic form lately, and this Crystal Palace team isn't necessarily as explosive as we probably thought they were when they kind of crumpled over this Arsenal team 3-0. I would say all these sort of options are a little bit overpriced in terms of Mount, Coutinho, and Zaha, and even though they are the talismans of their teams, I would say the actual production doesn't seem to be there, where I don't think these teams are actually creating enough significant chances. I might be wrong. I still think it probably makes a lot of sense to at least hold 2 out of 3 of these assets, or at least 1 out of the 3, and probably drop Havertz if you have the ability to do so, just because I think Lukaku will be playing a few more minutes as we head towards the later stages of the season. But Havertz is still a little bit of a tricky one because he is the more expensive option when it comes to Mount Havertz. So when I'm thinking about people who had wildcarded into Chelsea options, and I might be wrong after the United game, things might change once again in terms of how I view the assets. But at least in terms of short-term form, I would say if you had to go out of one of them, it would have to be Havertz, which is why I've sort of created a differentiation there, just to highlight that perhaps the priority is to move into Coutinho and Zaha, or at least to make sure that you actually reclaim one of Saka or Maddison, who probably will be slightly more interesting when we head towards Game Week 36, which I think is actually a slightly tougher double for Chelsea, especially since they don't necessarily have everything to play for in the league. As far as the options in the sort of higher end range, I really don't think there's much change here. KDB is someone who rises to the absolute top here. Watching him in Europe and just watching him week on week, I just think he's providing too much and producing too much from the creative end to really be discounted from teams. If you're a Kane owner, for example, or even a Son owner, I really would think about trying to redistribute your funds some way, somehow, into making sure you can afford KDB and kind of put him in your team. Bruno, someone who falls and perhaps even should be considered or classed as a differential. I might actually do that right now, to be honest, because I think that's actually a fair assessment of Bruno right now and his position in FPL. Mane is interesting, but as I said, still a little bit too pricey, and I really think that when you have the option of KDB on the other side of the pond, you would much rather go for KDB because you're getting so much guaranteed points from a double Liverpool defense if you haven't gone into that already. As far as the forwards, we have once again a very, very limited forward list, and the player who rises within the sort of budget range is going to be Weghorst once again. Weghorst was someone who did not interest me whatsoever in the sort of late stages of Dykes' tenure. However, with Ben Mee coming into part of the management staff and the sort of resurgence and a little bit of a bounce, Weghorst has temporarily looked as a very, very electric option. In fact, his expected goal involvements recently put him around the top stages of the league when it comes to games post the sacking of Sean Dyche. So he could be definitely an interesting option to think about keeping, at least in your team. If you have moved on from Weghorst, I would say you probably want to be. I think you'd probably be feeling confident in doing so. Maybe you'd like to go out of Tony into Weghorst, but Pukki for me still is the principal option, especially as we have the earlier double coming for Pukki in 36. With Mateta, you have a competing option with Weghorst as a doubler in Game Week 37, and Dennis for me is the second option I would think about in Game Week 36, although you also have Nketiah too. The issue with Nketiah, of course, is I still think Lacazette will actually find his way towards getting minutes, so if I was more confident about putting someone forward as a starter, it would be Dennis in Game Week 36. As far as the falls this week, they belong to Wood and Adams. Wood is just due to him being dropped from the lineup, and this Newcastle team honestly just looking much better without him, and also creating a lot of chances without him. One thing that I mentioned about Wood and why I wasn't interested in him in the free hit was that the numbers just didn't back him up. His expected goal per 90 numbers are actually half of what they were when he was actually playing under Sean Dyche earlier this season, and that shows you how this team isn't really able to play around Wood and perhaps his skill set as a player. So it's really clear that he doesn't really benefit from playing this Newcastle team, and therefore isn't a great option. As far as Adams, you have a player who's playing for simply one of the least productive teams. If you looked at Southampton, yes, it was interesting that they actually drew versus Brighton 2-2, but I really would have to say that's coming down to the heroics of James Ward-Prowse more than anything. Many of the chances that are falling to the forwards are very, very slim and very poor, and that's exactly why, for example, 2 weeks back we did drop Broja for that exact reason. Lacazette is someone who falls because we do see a lot of consistency with the minutes at Nketiah, and there were chances for Lacazette to come on as a sub, I would say, in the last 2 games, but it was clear that Arteta actually preferred keeping Nketiah on the pitch. Perhaps it's because his recovery from COVID is going a little bit slower than expected, but at that sort of price, there's just no real reason to hold on to Lacazette. And perhaps we might be seeing a fall into Werner soon lately just because he holds so much value. Jesus is going to be an interesting option, but I have a little bit of fear of putting him into the cheat sheet this week because he has played 2 games back-to-back for Man City, and I'm not sure if you'll catch that sort of flash in the pan 4-game sort of production from Jesus this weekend, and that's kind of my concern there. If he produces another great game and he actually starts another game for Man City, he's definitely on the cheat sheet, but just out of fear of rotation, I would say he's probably someone you'd like to avoid, maybe because he could be rested, as he could be seen as a focal point for the Real Madrid game, and perhaps Pep will see it as an opportunity on the weekend to play players who aren't so necessarily involved, such as Sterling and Grealish lately. With Kane and Ronaldo, I've dropped them both with falls. Ronaldo has sort of come and gone with his doubles, and Kane, unfortunately, just isn't an interesting option as someone who is that expensive. When you compare Kane and his price towards Son, we've said it all season, bar the few weeks where Kane did outscore Son, but overall you can see that the points have favored Son. Kane is still a much more expensive option. There's no real reason to hold him as an asset when you have other midfielders in the league who can create more points week on week. And I think that's the sort of issue. You have Kevin De Bruyne rising towards the top, which actually indirectly makes players like Kane and Ronaldo fall. Ronaldo's been very, very consistent. He looked fantastic versus Arsenal, and unfortunately, just this United team doesn't really give me much confidence to actually go with Ronaldo towards the end of the season. I'd much prefer a Kevin De Bruyne who could actually service many of his teammates with assists game on game, and actually also find goal scoring opportunities by himself, just like he did as he scored the opener versus Real Madrid. So that's sort of how I feel and envision the forwards, and that's kind of my thoughts for Game Week 35. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys very, very shortly.